Paul's letters to his beloved Ephractus church in Corinth are our most important historical source for understanding the real life of early Christians. If we lost every other writing of the New Testament and still had 1 Corinthians, we would know more about what it meant to be a Christian in a major urban center of the Roman Empire in the first generation than if we had all the others and had lost 1 Corinthians. These letters also give us deep insight into Paul's own self-understanding as an apostle. This emerges slightly in 1 Corinthians, especially in chapters 1 through 4 and chapter 9, but becomes the major theme in 2 Corinthians, as we will see in our next presentation. Any set of presentations on these writings must be selective. They are so rich and so dense. In this presentation, I will concentrate on 4 aspects of 1 Corinthians, namely the complexity of the interactions between Paul and this church, the occasion and the outline of 1 Corinthians as a guide to reading this difficult writing. Thirdly, I would like to get into the problems arising out of diversity, multiculturalism, and rivalry in the Corinthian community. And finally, look a bit at Paul's effort to change the Corinthians' way of thinking, or perhaps to change their way of imagining themselves. Paul's relations with the church that he founded in Corinth extended over a substantial period of time at the height of his Aegean ministry, that period when he was shuttling back and forth across the Aegean between Corinth and Ephesus in Asia Minor, and involved frequent exchanges. We are able to date the founding of this church with some precision because the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 18, verses 1 through 4, tells us that when Paul arrived in Corinth, he met Priscilla and Aquila, who had just been expelled from Rome. This was a Jewish couple who had been expelled from Rome and met Paul in Corinth. From the Roman historian Suetonius, we know that that expulsion of the Jews from Rome, because of a commotion created concerning a certain Christus, or perhaps the Christ, occurred in the year 49. Furthermore, at the end of Paul's stay in Corinth, Acts recounts that he was hailed before the proconsul Gallio. By sheer luck, we have found an inscription at Delphi in Greece, which gives us an indication that Gallio was indeed proconsul in Corinth between the years 51 and 52. So, since Acts tells us that Paul stayed in Corinth at least 18 months, we're able to put his initial sojourn there between roughly 50 and 51. So we have a pretty good dating. In fact, this is probably our best Archimedean point by which to establish a New Testament chronology, moving before this and after this in terms of trying to figure out when things happened. But after that initial 18-month stay with this community, Paul visited them at least twice more. We don't know how successfully. We have indications that perhaps his visits were not terribly successful. He mentions in 2 Corinthians that they were much more impressed by his letters, which were powerful, than by his personal presence, which apparently was rhetorically deficient. We also see that delegates from Paul, Timothy and Titus, and at least one unnamed brother as well, were sent by Paul for various reasons to the church at Corinth, and that the Corinthians sent Paul delegates, like the household servants of the wealthy woman Chloe, to give messages to Paul. So we have frequent personal exchanges. In addition, we have the correspondence. But by looking at the correspondence carefully, it is clear that it was much more extensive than the 2 letters to the Corinthians which are extant. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 9, Paul mentions a first letter that he wrote to them. He said, "In my earlier letter, I warned you to stay away from immoral people." I didn't mean the immoral people in the world, because then you'd have to go out of the world completely. He meant immoral people within the community. So there was a first letter which we no longer have, we assume, in which Paul sort of warned the Corinthian community concerning immorality within the community. Then we have a letter that at least some of the Corinthians wrote to Paul asking for his advice on matters concerning everyday matters of diet, sexuality, and as well certain matters pertaining to worship, especially the use of spiritual gifts within the assembly. We know about that letter because in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 1, Paul says, "Now concerning the matters about which you wrote," and the rest of 1 Corinthians 7 through 14 takes up in sequence the matters about which they had questioned him. So we really do have a kind of a dialogical element in 1 Corinthians. Thirdly, we have our present 1 Corinthians. And I agree with the majority of scholars who think that 1 Corinthians is a single letter written at a single time. That is, it's not only an authentic letter of Paul, but it has literary integrity. It is a single rhetorical unit. Then, in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 4, Paul refers to a letter that he wrote rebuking a member of the community in Corinth that he wrote in distress and anguish and many tears, and which created, we gather, a certain amount of consternation in that community. Does he mean 1 Corinthians, or is he referring to another letter? We are not certain. Finally, we have Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, which most scholars today think is not a literary integrity, but rather an edited composite of as much as up to 5 separate notes that Paul wrote to the Corinthians. We will take up that difficult issue in the next presentation when we talk about 2 Corinthians. So we have, at best, only a portion of this extensive exchange. We have no access to Paul's personal visits. We don't know what happened in the visits of the delegates, and we have only a portion of the correspondence. So we hear only fragments of a two-way conversation which was very extensive, and we must be very modest in our conclusions concerning historical events as they unravel in the Corinthian community. Especially, we have to bear in mind that in every instance we have only what Paul reports and Paul's perceptions of the situation. It's very tricky trying to say the Corinthians were doing this and that. We have to remember that Paul was operating on the basis of what was reported to him and his perceptions of what they were doing. And this is one of the reasons why it's very difficult to really create a history of early Christianity. We really have a series of responses by authors to situations that are happening in communities. By paying close attention to 1 Corinthians, we are able, with some plausibility, to reconstruct the series of events that led up to the writing of 1 Corinthians, and this helps us establish an outline of that letter, which might guide us through what otherwise appears as a somewhat chaotic composition. The first thing is that the Corinthian community, as it was founded by Paul, was a remarkably enthusiastic, intelligent, and gifted community. This was not a church made up of slackers or of the tepid. They were full of enthusiasm. Paul himself acknowledges in the very beginning of his letter that they are deeply enriched in speech and in knowledge. They lack no spiritual gift. This, in fact, may be part of the problem. It's a community full of smart and gifted people who have their own minds about what should be happening. Although they enjoy powerful religious experiences, they cannot seem to agree on how to translate those experiences into moral behavior. What's the connection between religion and morality is the basic issue here. If we have experienced powerful transforming experiences because of the resurrection of Jesus, what does that mean for the way in which we should live our lives? Some of these problems have to do with the way in which the saints, as Paul calls them, are to relate to the world in matters of sexual behavior, diet, association. Others concern the way in which community worship was being carried out. and was being divisive, especially because of abuses at the Lord's Supper and because of the way in which people were preferring spectacular spiritual gifts like speaking in tongues, called glossolalia, to other more modest and rational forms of discourse in the community assembly. So because of these differences that they cannot resolve among themselves, some in the community, it appears, suggest that they should turn to Paul, their founder, for advice. That suggestion apparently sets off even deeper divisions within the community, having to do with who is fit to teach us, since we're so smart and gifted. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 10, Paul says, "It has been reported reliably to me that there are divisions among you, some people saying, 'I'm for Paul,' others saying, 'I'm for Cephas,'" that is, the name means rock, which is a translation of Peter, so it means Peter the apostle. So I'm for Paul, I'm for Peter, I'm for Apollos, say a third group. Apollos was Paul's colleague that had followed Paul to Corinth and had preached there in the meantime. And then another group that says, "I'm for Christ." Okay. So apparently what we have then is a situation in which this community is so fractious and so refractory that it's trying to decide who ought to teach it, and they can't agree upon from whom they should take any kind of moral advice. Paul, their founder, Apollos, who apparently is rhetorically more gifted than Paul, Peter, who has all the credentials as being the one, you know, an eyewitness of the resurrection and one chosen by Jesus. And by the way, this is evidence that Peter probably passed through the Corinthian community at some point in his career. Or a smug group perhaps in the corner that says, "We're not interested in that, we have a direct pipeline to Jesus, we're the Christ party." So Paul says, is Christ divided? And he needs to deal with this kind of situation. Thirdly, in the meantime, members of Chloe's household, clearly allies of Paul, probably have delivered the letter from the Paul party to Paul over there in Ephesus, and they report that things have gone from bad to worse. Since this initial division, we have people acting out in inappropriate ways. There's a member of the community who's living with his mother-in-law in what is at least technically or legally an incestuous relationship and still wants to be part of the table fellowship. We have people who either are or are promising to go to have sex with prostitutes to make a point about their freedom in Christ. And worst of all, in Paul's view, they are trying to settle these issues of what Paul calls tabiotika, everyday matters, in pagan courts. It's somewhat analogous to the situation in contemporary American Christianity, in which Christians stand on both sides of the abortion debate and can't resolve it themselves, and so they go to the Supreme Court to try to get the highest court in the land to resolve what is an internal issue of moral discernment in the Christian community. Something very similar is happening in this first century community. We are struck by the fact that anybody who has romantic notions about the origins of Christianity and is seduced by the idyllic position of the first description of the first Christians in the Acts of the Apostles as being perfectly united in spirit, sharing all their possessions, and enjoying an idyllic existence. People like this should read 1 Corinthians to understand how strong personalities, power and prophecy can unite in a heady mixture of divisiveness and rivalry, and that's clearly what's happening in the Corinthian community. The outline of 1 Corinthians corresponds to Paul's rhetorical challenge, and it can best be understood when we see how the occasion of the letter was set up by these kinds of situations. They want Paul, those who want to hear from him at all, they want Paul to tell them who's right. Paul's challenge is to try to get them to imagine what it means to be righteous. That is, to be in a right relationship. And so he writes them what is in effect a real letter, but rhetorically it is a protreptic discourse on harmony, on concord within a community. So even as he is addressing their specific questions, he is trying to raise them to a higher level of imagination. The point for Paul is not who's right, theoretically, but how do you live together in a community. In order to do this, rhetorically, Paul must first establish his credentials to teach them. And this occupies chapters 1 through 4 of 1 Corinthians. Paul begins by reminding them that they are not the Corinthians community, they're not Paul's community, they're not Peter's or Apollos' community. This is not a Greco-Roman club. They are God's church. God called them into existence. So they don't belong to themselves. Paul says, what is it that you have that you haven't received? Everything is gift. Second, he reminds them that the shape of this gift didn't come through the fact that they were the best and the brightest. He says, not many of you were well born. Not many of you were powerful. They came from the least likely folks to be called into this community. And furthermore, they were called into the community by a message concerning, let us not forget, a crucified Messiah, somebody who was executed as a criminal. So Paul in 1 Corinthians 1:18 following develops this astonishing argument concerning the sort of countercultural implications of the Christian message. That if you are proclaiming the power of God through a crucified Messiah, you are not meeting the cultural and human expectations of Greek people who are looking for wisdom, because this is a pretty foolish way to work. And you're not meeting Jewish expectations of powerful messianic signs, because Jesus, by those criteria, was a failed Messiah. So Paul says everything in your community has to be marked by this paradox that God has worked among you through weakness to give you strength, through foolishness to give you wisdom. Somehow your relationships have to be marked by that characteristic. Thirdly, Paul tries to demonstrate that he and Apollos, and it looks like the battle is mainly between them in the Corinthian side, that he and Apollos are not rivals but colleagues. And in two striking images, Paul says, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gives the growth. I laid the foundation, Apollos built on it, but you are God's building. Okay. So he reminds them that he and Apollos each have their function with regard to the community, and what he wants to do is to exemplify cooperation. He wants to exemplify through the relationship of himself and Apollos how they are to view being part of God's community. They should work together rather than as rivals. But finally, Paul gets to the point, which is, he says, although you have many pedagogues or teachers in Christ, you have only one Father. It's me. I founded the community, and in the ancient Greco-Roman Empire, it was the father who got to teach morality. So I'm your father, sit down and listen. Okay. Having established his credentials to teach them, Paul then engages in chapters 5 and 6 in some quick social engineering of the sort that we saw in the second letter to the Thessalonians. Paul says, guy who's living in incest, this falls even below the level of pagan morality. Kick him out. Excommunicate him until he changes his ways. People going to prostitutes, this is really dumb and stupid. Sex is not like eating peanuts, okay? It has real implications. Stop doing it. But his harshest criticism is concerning their going to pagan courts. He says, you're so arrogant. You're trying to figure out who's worthy of, you're trying to judge who's worthy to teach you, and you're not paying attention to your own moral behavior. You're not judging yourselves. Then in chapter 7, he takes up the questions that they have posed him, treating in turn the issue of marriage and celibacy, diet, whether or not they can eat food offered to idols, or whether they can eat at a pagan shrine. Beginning in chapter 11, he takes up issues having to do with worship. Abuses at the Lord's Supper, women prophesying and praying without having their heads covered. Then the dispute over the spiritual gifts, especially prophecy and glossolalia, or speaking in tongues. Finally, in chapter 15, Paul provides them with a discourse on the resurrection. in which he tries to make exactly the opposite point that he made in 1 Thessalonians. Again, he's talking about the end time. In 1 Thessalonians, Paul had to remind them of the already, because they were obsessed with the not yet. The problem with the Corinthians is that they think they have everything already. Paul mocks them in chapter 4, verse 8. Already you are rich. Already you are filled. Already you are sitting on thrones. Well, in chapter 15, he reminds them, you can't be sitting on thrones because there ain't no kingdom yet. God's triumph is not yet complete. The resurrection of Jesus is the first fruits of this triumph. And in order for God to triumph over sin, of which there's a lot in your community, and over death, they must undergo a moral transformation. So with regard to the end time, Paul says, we will not all fall asleep before Jesus comes, but we all must be changed. And what he's talking about is a moral transformation in their behavior. Finally, in chapter 16, Paul takes up what he's most interested in, namely the collection for the saints in Jerusalem, giving some practical instructions as to how they should contribute to that collection. That will become a bone of contention. We will take it up in the next lecture. Now let's look at the issues, because what is happening in the Corinthian community really happens in many intentional religious communities throughout the ages. It was not clear to the Corinthians how the experience of the Holy Spirit should yield behavioral norms. And the struggle that they and Paul face on this point reveals two significant things about nascent Christianity. The first is that early Christianity did have powerful experiences that drew people into fellowship. This is a point which is too seldom recognized and acknowledged by scholars. If, in fact, powerful things weren't happening among them, there would be no issue at all. Nowhere in Paul's letters do we find the suggestion that people consider Jesus just a moral teacher from the past. They shared the conviction that he was a powerful risen Lord, that this Holy Spirit, this energy field had been given to them, and that they had been caught up in it, and that things were happening. Things were popping in their community. The second thing that is clear to us is that there was no automatic set of moral guidelines that should go with such experiences. If they were all Jewish, they would have had such a set of moral guidelines found in Torah. But for Gentile Christians, or for a mixed community, it was not clear. How does this radical experience of God translate into, for example, sexual mores? Should we practice monogamy, as in Judaism? Everybody get married? Should we be virgins? Should we all mate with the cult leader? Should we all have sex indiscriminately? What is the moral corollary? If we are in the resurrection life and we all living like angels, why shouldn't we couple like rabbits? Anyway, what is it? Sex doesn't matter, you see. So the two basic positions followed in the community are what Paul identifies as the strong position and the weak position. Today, we would call the strong position liberals. These in the Corinthian community emphasized the stability and sturdiness of their identity. They saw the transformation worked by the Spirit as completely internal. It was a matter of knowledge, and knowledge gives freedom. Okay? So their minds have been transformed. Their true identity is internal, sort of like our adolescence. You know, it doesn't matter if I have a messy room, the real me is neat, you know. Clearly, when the strong position also emphasizes individualism, the liberty of the individual. And it tends to downplay the significance of the body and of society. If my true identity is inward and nothing can touch it, because as long as my thoughts are clean, nothing else matters, then what I eat, how I engage in sexual activity, is irrelevant. So this is a kind of a laissez-faire position. Because they've been empowered, they are freed. The weak position, on the other hand, can legitimately be called conservative. They think identity is very much a matter of the body and of society, and therefore is weak and threatened. They take seriously the implications of what to eat and who you associate with. And like conservatives generally, they want rules, preferably uniform rules that apply to everybody in matters of food and drink and sexuality and the order of worship. All things should be done decently and in good order if we are together to worship God. Now, Paul's response to these kinds of positions is remarkable for its complexity and subtlety, as he seeks a way for both sides to gain a higher plane of moral perception. He really appeals to their imagination, to begin to think not so much in terms of who's right, but how do we live together as a community, a corporate identity. Now, there are 4 points that I want to make here about Paul's approach to them. In some respects, he agrees with the strong, remarkably. Paul agrees that their identity is strong and firm, but he disagrees about the basis of that strength. It's not because their identity is mental, it's because God has gifted them and God is faithful. So Paul is for freedom as much as possible, because that is what God has called them into. In other respects, he agrees with the weak, because he agrees that identity is not a matter simply of interiority, it's also a corporate matter involving your body and the community body. So who you have sex with, their motto was food for the belly and the belly for food, right? Material processes is completely unconnected to anything spiritual. Paul said, no, sex is not like eating peanuts. Sex is not a purely physical transaction, it's a spiritual transaction. It has implications. So he calls them to this higher awareness of a corporate reality. Secondly, he thinks that both sides are wrong by seeking to be right at the expense of righteousness. And this is where he comes down so strongly on them for going to pagan courts to try to solve their problems. Paul much prefers ambiguity of life together than a community separated into mutually opposing and theoretically correct factions. Thirdly, he calls them to live according to this pattern of self-emptying that is found in the death of Jesus. I spoke earlier about Paul's discourse in chapter 1, verse 18 following, on how God's power had come through the message of the cross. God's foolishness is stronger than human wisdom. God's weakness is stronger than human strength. At the end of that discourse, Paul says, we have the Spirit, not of the world, but that has come from God. So the way God has worked is the Spirit that is supposed to work in us. And then he says in chapter 2, verse 16, we have the mind of Christ, nous Christou. The term nous in ancient moral philosophy meant what we would call a mindset. We have the disposition, we have the attitudes, we have the way of viewing reality that belongs to Jesus. This is extremely important for Paul. How Jesus is important for him, the human figure of Jesus, is not in the incidentals of his historical past, but in the form of his consciousness, in the pattern of his existence. Okay? The mind of Christ for Paul is exemplified by a life in which one is willing to give up one's own wisdom and to look foolish so that others can be wiser. One in which one can give up a little bit of one's own strength so that those who are weak can become stronger. So fourthly, the pattern by which all members of the community can grow stronger is by seeking to build up the whole community rather than themselves. Paul uses this amazing image of the body of the Messiah in chapter 12, verses 12 through 31. In which he sees the community as a living, interrelated organism in which the health and life of each part of the organism depends upon the life and health of the whole organism. And we see him here using a principle that he will develop much more in 2 Corinthians, that of reconciliation and reciprocity, which is so countercultural back then and today. The strong don't become stronger by eliminating the weak. Everybody becomes stronger by making the whole community stronger.